Hello, guys. Today we have Joseph Brandt talking with us. He's from Ventura US Fish Wildlife. He has done multiple things with the Condor program, and I've seen him a couple of times in my classes and just videos of him talking and basically playing with very big birds, and it sounds very cool. But I guess today we get to find out a little bit more about him in person and not just a YouTube video, so I'm very excited. So if are you allowed to screen share?
Looks like I am.
Okay, well then I think you're good to go.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Mia, and thanks everyone for having me. I see some familiar faces from all sorts of different avenues, but I'm really excited to talk to you all today. Today, my presentation is a little different than I usually give because I usually talk a lot about condors, which I still will. You're not going to get out of that, but I'm sort of doing it today through the lens of my own experience as a, as a student, and then into aspiring biologist, and then sort of getting me to where I am today. So it's sort of the angle that I'm taking. So let me share my screen. I think this is the one. Yep. And then if I go up to here, there's a present somewhere.
You can go to the bottom right.
Oh yeah.
Thanks. That I gotta say,
There it is.
picture, man. Holy
All right. So if folks have questions, it doesn't seem like we have a huge group. I'm gonna just so I can see where I'm at in the slides. If folks have questions, just feel free to shout out, and we'll just sort of get going, and there'll be time for questions afterwards. I got maybe 20 slides or 25 slides or something to get through. So yeah, I'm a biologist with the Ventura Fish and Wildlife Service office. The Ventura Fish and Wildlife Service office is actually a different office than I spent most of my career, and where I did the work with California condors. The office I was in previously, where I spent close to 15 years, was the Hopper Mountain National Wildlife Refuge office. So the Fish and Wildlife Service has many different divisions, and refuges are sort of, the refuge branch is sort of the place where there's kind of land being managed, and there's usually a lot more sort of on the ground, sort of getting your hands dirty, getting your boots muddy kind of work happening. Condors are a little bit of an interesting, program, because while it is an endangered species program, which is often housed in a ecological services office, the office that I'm currently sitting in, it's just been long connected with the refuge complex that I previously worked out of, the Hopper Mountain National Wildlife Refuge Complex. And so I'll get into that. But before I do, I wanted to talk a little bit about me. So I grew up in upstate New York, not New York City, New York, but up in central New York. This is actually this. Can you see my cursor? Also, hopefully. Yeah. So this is actually a Google Earth. I'd never done this before, except for this presentation. I thought it was pretty cool. But this is the house that I grew up in. It's actually my sister purchased it from my sister, or from my parents, and still live there. We lived in a rural part of central New York. And so, yeah, we had pasture lands. I grew up on a sort of a small farm. My folks, our freezer was filled with mostly the meat from the cows and the pigs and the chickens that we raised ourselves. We had about 60 acres pasture, and then hardwood forests. So I feel super fortunate to have that sort of childhood and upbringing. I ended up going to a more of a kind of suburban high school because my mother worked for that school. Both my parents are not college educated. They were sort of blue collar, but I ended up sort of getting funneled into this suburban school, which I think had a little more sort of on track to do sort of college and that sort of thing. During high school, I was really into history, and I was sort of had this infatuation with Indiana Jones and wanted to be Indiana Jones when I grew up. This was probably even before high school, but that's where I thought I was going. I ended up going to a 4-year school called Lemoyne College in Syracuse, which is the closest larger city that I grew up in. Had a terrible time there. Ended up, leaving that school after my first year there. Probably, I was carrying like a D average. It was not a good fit for me. Ended up going back to a 2-year school to become a structural firefighter. Ended up from that work becoming an EMT, and then ended up working in a hospital on a hematology oncology floor. And after about a year working in that hospital, I actually was a hematology oncology pediatrics floor, and I was a clinical technician there. And after about a year of working in that hospital, through some encouragement of some of my firefighting instructors, I applied to the University of Oregon and moved all the way across the country and became a duck. And that was really sort of where birds first began to be a part of my life, being an Oregon duck. At the University of Oregon, I started out as an environmental science major. I quickly realized that major was something that was sort of a jack of all trades, but I really wanted to sink my teeth into something that was a bit more specific. So I ended up double majoring in biology and environmental science. Started working as an undergraduate at one of the research labs at the University of Oregon. It was an evolution or ecology and evolution lab that studied the purple pitcher plant mosquito. I also studied at the Oregon Institute of Marine Biology because the University of Oregon is less of an applied and more of a say maybe lab school, I guess, or less of a field school and more of a lab school. And the Oregon Institute of Marine Biology was a way for me to get field work. That sort of carries over. I think my underlying desire to be Indiana Jones was really, I just wanted to be outside doing something that wasn't sitting at a desk. Ended up fighting wildland fires while I was in school there as a sort of way to help pay for college and pass the summers by. And then also while I was at the University of Oregon, I really got into rock climbing. I became I had terms where every weekend I was out at a crag or climbing a mountain with a close group of friends. So I graduated from the University of Oregon. I sort of always thought I was going to go back to graduate school, and I ended up not going back to graduate school. I sort of fell into doing field work, like many aspiring wildlife biologists do. And this is sort of a smattering of some of the field work that I ended up doing. I started out in along the Northern Divide in northwestern Montana on a grizzly bear DNA project. I think some of the skills that I developed while at the University of Oregon in the Outdoor Pursuits program and as a mountaineer and a climber really helped me land that job. Notice it wasn't my grades, and it really wasn't. I don't really think it was. I mean, the fact that I had a degree in biology got the foot in the door, but I think I was selected for the position for a skill set that was completely unrelated to biology, or unrelated to the academic side of biology. So I ended up chasing or running around in the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, collecting bear hair samples in one of the most remote parts or one of the largest wilderness areas anyways in the lower 48 states. Ended up going back to Oregon to study seabirds in the Columbia River estuary, worked on a Caspian tern study, a double-crested cormorant study, also did point count or nesting counts for Brandt's cormorants, which was pretty cool because of the namesake. From there, went to the Fish and Wildlife Service and interned on the Condor program for a short period of time, about 4 months, sort of got my first exposure to condors. Had some pretty cool things happen there while I was an intern because of my rock climbing skills. Again, a skill that I didn't ever plan to make something as a part of my career, but it was a bit foreboding. After that, I went down to the Strait of Magellan, studied on a penguin colony for about 3 or 4 months. and was a colony monitor there, lived with 2 Chilenos on a small island in the Strait of Magellan in a lighthouse with 300,000 Magellanic penguins. Came back from that and fell into more condor work with the Ventana Wildlife Society. That's sort of up in the Big Sur, the Ventana Wilderness and the Los Padres and the sort of the Big Sur coastline. And really that's kind of set me on a track to do work with the California condors. And that was a pretty quick rundown of who I was, but I think it's sort of important because, you know, as you all as students, I think it's important to emphasize that for many of us, things are not a straight arrow, you know, it's not a straight path. My path meandered, I was kind of all over the place for a while, but it was pretty clear, like once I found, you know, my love for biology, my love for environmental science, like I really sunk my teeth into it. And, you know, that was reflected in my just overall attitude towards school, my grades, everything just became, you know, this was what, you know, really became on my terms. I was no longer going to school for the sake of going to school or because it was like, you know, the next step after high school. The California Condor Recovery Program. I'm going to kind of get into a little bit of condor biology just because I think it will help lay the groundwork for sort of what I'm hoping to get across with this presentation, which is it's not always the skills that you gain in school, or it's often the skills that you gain in school in combination with things that you continue to learn, or you may never have otherwise. That is sort of the selling point for you to get a career in conservation or in wildlife biology or sort of wherever you're going to go. I had you know, I never thought that, you know, being a rock climber or a mountaineer was going to translate into, you know, becoming a biologist on one of the, you know, preeminent conservation programs in the country. But it's sort of how I got there in a lot of ways. So the California Condor Recovery Program, condors are North America's largest bird. They have about a 10-foot wingspan. They're also one of the world's most endangered birds. So at one point in time, the number of birds that are in this photograph, which if you've been counting is 22, was the wild population for condors. So there were 23 condors in the world, and one was in captivity, and 22 of them were in the wild. And, you know, I snapped this photo out doing, you know, just a day of work. And, you know, it was pretty crazy to sort of think about that. There's 22 birds, you know, just flying right in front of me. At one time, that was all of the condors that were in the world.
Hey, Brandt, can I ask, Joseph, can I ask?
Yeah.
Where the picture was taken, or is that not allowed?
Yeah, this is actually looking down find my cursor here. This is the Santa Susana range. So CSUCI is maybe like, I don't know, behind these mountains right here. And then, you know, Point Magoo is maybe right there. And so this is looking, you know, Fillmore would be, you know, this hill right here is blocking Fillmore. So it's looking down into the Santa Clara River Valley out towards, kind of to the south, slightly west. So at the Hopper Mountain National Wildlife Refuge. Condors, yeah, I mean, just to kind of, you know, hit that point home, this is sort of where we are with condors in a super quick nutshell. You know, in the 1960s, they estimated populations to be in the 50s. Really small population even then. It was clear that the condor populations had been in decline for probably the last century, maybe around since the point of European colonization of North America, or shortly thereafter. And then, you know, the real population estimates that began in the 80s really just continued to track what would have been extinction. And so it was really the low point was in the early 80s here, 1982, 83, where the decision was made to extirpate the population, the remaining condors in the wild, into captivity and start growing a captive population and for the purposes of captive breeding. And so for about a little less than a decade, but from that point when that decision was made, it was about a decade before they started reintroducing condors back into the wild. That was in 1992, and in Southern California, in the mountains just above Fillmore. And the population has sort of grown since then, mostly driven by captive releases. So this sort of blue wedge here is the captive released population. And then in the early 2000s, 2003 or so, or 2003, 2004, the condor flocks started reproducing in the wild, and now we have a growing population of wild-fledged birds too. So that population that was released from captivity is starting to breed and producing offspring, which are now even producing offspring. And so you'll notice for the most part, the condor population, and again, the driver being captive releases, has grown fairly, pretty much every year except for last year. Last year, there was a few different factors, and we can get into them if folks have a question about it, but it had a lot to do with the fires, the Dolan fire up in Big Sur. And then there were some sort of construction activities in the captive breeding program that meant the captive production of for 2019, which ends up being the birds we released in 2020, didn't produce as many condors. So we didn't really have the means to grow the population, especially given the fact that we lost 9 free-flying condors and 2 chicks because of the Dolan fire in Big Sur last year. So where we're at now, the condor population is about a little over 500. That a little more than half of those birds are in the wild, and about 200 of those birds, or 186 of those birds, are in the wild in California, split between Southern and Central California flocks. Another 100 birds or so are in the Arizona-Utah population. And there's also a small but growing population in the San Pedro Martir in Baja California, Mexico. The captive population is pretty stable now. It fluctuates between 150 and maybe 180 birds. And those are mostly captive pairs that are breeding in captivity at a handful of breeding centers along the West Coast. It's the San Diego Zoo, the LA Zoo, the World Center of Birds of Prey, which is in Boise, Idaho, and the Oregon Zoo all have captive breeding populations. Give you an idea of the condor's size. They're the 10-foot wingspan, and it gives you a comparison from a turkey vulture to a condor with golden eagles in between. So here are those wild populations.
Very quick question.
Yep.
Joseph, but you may just jump right to this. I'm very interested in those birds in Mexico, and whether those were releases in Mexico or did they move from the other populations?
Yes, they were releases in Mexico. So yeah, there were, so all California condors were extirpated from the wild. So there were no wild condors from 1987 until 1992. And then these populations, I'm kind of showing you now via a graphic, were really bolstered by these release sites, which are these stars. And so there was a release site created by the San Diego Zoo in the San Pedro Martir. The Peregrine Fund developed a release site in along the north rim, or close to the north rim of the Grand Canyon in the Vermilion Cliffs. The Fish and Wildlife Service manages a release site at what was once at Hopper Mountain National Wildlife Refuge and is now at Bitter Creek National Wildlife Refuge. The Ventana Wildlife Society and the Pinnacles National Park both manage release sites that kind of create the Central California flock. And there's actually plans, people may have seen in the news, the Yurok tribe and Redwood National Park are just kind of past the last regulatory hurdle to move forward with a condor release site in Northern California, at Redwood National Park up near Arcata and Humboldt. So they may be releasing birds as early as this fall, or more likely, just given they finally got over that last hurdle. They've got to build a flight pen and do things. I would expect condors to be in the skies in Northern California by this time next year for sure. So I worked for Fish and Wildlife Service for the first, 15 years or so of my career at the Hopper Mountain National Wildlife Complex, which has 4 different refuges in that complex: the Hopper Mountain National Wildlife Refuge, which is where that previous photo was from, and the Bitter Creek National Wildlife Refuge, which I know some of you have been and visited. Both were created for condors. Relative to condor range, as you'll see, they are postage stamps. So they play a really important role because there are sites that we can sort of do condor management and release condors from. But in reality, they are, in terms of habitat, even the about 15,000 acres that is Bitter Creek is like next to nothing in terms of a condor's habitat needs. So the Southern California flock, I just wanted to kind of give people a perspective in terms of my career and where it stands. I started in 2005 as an intern. We had 19 condors in the wild in that flock. And when I finished in 2019, there were about 100. So it was pretty insane to see the condor population grow almost 5-fold during my time. And I learned a ton during again, the cards aligned, and I was fortunate enough to sort of take on a leadership role. I became the lead biologist for that program from 2009 through 2019. So for the last 10 years, I was kind of supervising the field team and leading the reintroduction effort in Southern California. So condor conservation, like most endangered species conservation, boiled down, it seems pretty simple. You have a species, it's not doing well because of, it either doesn't have habitat or something is killing it, or it's, incapable of reproducing. And thus you just need to solve those, really simple problems to recover the species. Of course, when you start layering on, the various threats that might interact with those, with those kind of 3 main goals, and then you throw on sort of the human element and how you manage those various threats and sort of human elements, things become spaghetti. And that's really the point of this sort of diagram, is really just kind of convey to you, there's lots of sort of interconnected relationships that created lots of opportunities for me to continue learning well beyond my, my education, so to speak, at the University of Oregon. But it also created lots of opportunities for myself and the team that I led to apply skill sets that we would have never imagined applying to condor recovery. One of those first skill sets is ArcGIS. So this is a fairly obvious one. I think people see the sort of where a lot of wildlife biology is going and understanding animal movements. It's just, sort of goes hand in hand. GIS skills are a huge part of our work as wildlife biologists now. For condors, we are attaching devices onto them, which allow us to track their movements and understand where any individual's condor is going, but then also sort of using our GIS skills to sort of integrate how a population is moving across the landscape and identifying sort of important areas of habitat. So this sort of heat map on the right is kind of areas. It's a kernel density estimate. It's it shows areas where there are much high condor activity, and also areas where just condors are moving in general over the course of a year. This is data from 2019. Condors are obligate soarers. They can move across the landscape with ease. They can fly well over 100 miles in a day, and so being able to attach devices to them to track their movements has really been, sort of blown our understanding of condors' habitat use and how they use the landscape, in ways that we just would have never been able to understand without that technology and without the use of ArcGIS. We can, for example, see how condor movements or how condor movement or the condor distribution has expanded over years. This is a map showing sort of the 5-year, where condors were in 2005 in Southern California, and 2010 to 2015. Like I said, this is 2019. You can see we have flights upwards. I think we were 10 miles shy of Yosemite National Park that year. So condors are expanding in their range, which is exciting and great. Well, something that's not so exciting and great is we also, by attaching devices to condors, are able to identify when condors die, recover their carcasses, and then send those carcasses to a lab that's able to identify their cause of death. So we do have, over the time since 1992 to present, we've had 380 condors die, 213 we know the cause of death of, and over half of those causes of death were lead poisoning. Really sort of depressing, but also important part of endangered species recovery is to know what's causing the species to be endangered. And because there were so few condors in the wild when we really realized the condors were in trouble, they didn't have this information. So by reintroducing birds back into the wild, we started to learn this, and that was a big part of the early period of condor recovery post reintroduction.
Joseph, is that 50% rate for lead consistent through the whole time series, or has it reduced in the last decade?
No, it's probably early on the condor early on, the condor populations were very tied to the release site and supplemental food.
Yes.
Because they were very young. And then as the population began to expand and kind of recolonize lots of habitat, we've seen sort of an increase of lead exposure. We have seen in probably the last 5 years since the ban, the lead exposure rates have sort of flatlined. They haven't increased, which is actually, if you're thinking about lead as a problem and thinking about California and how they've tried to solve that problem through legislation, because lead is now banned in California, we expected, if we were to just look at what the condors were doing over that period of time, continuing to expand their range into areas where we hadn't been able to do lead outreach, we would, and continuing to sort of increasingly feed on carcasses that are not being provided by the program, we would have expected an increase in lead exposure rates, but instead it's been sort of flat. So I think there is some silver lining in that. Obviously, it's not gone. We haven't seen a decline yet, but I think some of that decline is something I'm going to sort of get into and what it will take to get there. So lead poisoning, just quickly, is caused by the ingestion of carcasses that have been shot with lead ammunition. Lead is ballistically of really sort of good, in a lot of ways, it has a lot of ballistic qualities or qualities that are good for ballistics. And so hunters use lead because it will kill the animal fairly quickly. There are alternatives to lead that will do the same thing, fortunately, but lead has been the predominant type of ammunition used for hunting and for big game, small game, bird. It's just a very, very common material used in ammunition. Unfortunately for condors, that's meant when they recover a gut pile or an unrecovered shot animal and consume that animal, because they are scavengers, or that's all the only, hunting is not the only food source, but it is a major food source for condors, because humans are on the landscape killing animals, and condors are utilizing that death or that mortality as a food source. Condors will often, this is sort of the pictograph of condor lead exposure. So a hunter or someone shooting wildlife shoots an animal, say through the neck. You can, this is a radiograph of a deer that was shot with lead through the neck, and you can see the fragments of lead in the deer's tissue. So this is the wound channel. The bullet probably came in from the bottom side of this picture. It traveled through, and you can sort of see the cone of fragments. All these little white radiopaque fragments are lead. They're much more radiopaque than bone fragments, so you can pretty easily tell that these are metal fragments. Went through the spine, fragmented even more because it went through bone. It does fragment even if it goes through soft tissue. And then the large part of the bullet left the animal, but it left behind all these fragments. Well, condors aren't stupid. They use wound channels and eyeballs and mouths and anuses as an easy way in to get at the meat of a carcass. And so if the animal is, say, unrecovered, they'll start sticking their head in that wound channel and start eating the tissue around there. These fragments are small enough that you just don't, they're gobbling things down by the mouthful. They don't chew their food. They're just gobbling it down. And a lot of these fragments are so small that even if you were to try to cut that portion of the meat out, there's no guarantee you would get everything, say if you were a hunter and doing that. So that's sort of the pathway for condor lead exposure. Twice a year, we would trap condors and handle them, pull their blood, and test them for lead. And so this is sort of a way for us to kind of measure lead exposure rates across the population, at least at 2 times a year. Condors that were showing any sort of clinical, or condors that do show any sort of clinical signs of lead exposure, lead toxicity, so lethargy, crop stasis, anything like that, are transported to, in Southern California, the Los Angeles Zoo, but they're transported to a veterinary facility to be treated with a chelation agent to remove the lead from their system or from their blood. They're also radiographed, and we can find those same fragments, the ones here, in their GI tract often. And so when we have a condor that has lead in their GI tract, they often have to undergo surgery, or they're fed a type of diet that will cause them to regurgitate those fragments. So that's sort of how we are dealing with the proximate threat of lead. Of course, dealing with that is really just putting a Band-Aid on a bleeding wound if we don't do something about the ultimate solution or the underlying causes of lead toxicosis, which is working with the hunting and ranching communities, the populations that are out there shooting wildlife, often for good reasons. And I'm a hunter myself. I think hunting is a part of the way we manage wildlife in the United States. It has a long history tied to conservation of species. So it's really sort of working with the hunting community to educate them on understanding the effects that lead ammunition is having, and then presenting non-lead or a non-lead alternative that is effective, that is just as an effective tool for their purposes of harvesting game. This is there's a lot of veterinary skills involved in the animal handling and the treatment of birds. Like, again, as a biologist, I mean, you could sort of see where pulling blood or providing intramuscular injections or learning how to work a radiograph might play into your career. This is a marketing career. Really, how we communicate with a community that needs to be sort of convinced of a problem and effectively change their behavior to help correct that problem. And the state, California, we went down the road of legislation. The politics of today, legislation is not always the best solution. It's certainly a tool in the tool belt, but it still requires a huge amount of education and outreach. And in all honesty, if I could go back in time, I would have held off on legislating against lead until we had a larger community of hunters that were supportive of that legislation. Currently, it sort of went backwards. We put the cart before the horse, and we didn't get a response. We took one step forward, and that caused us to take 2 steps back with the community that we were trying to compel to change their behavior. It was a lot harder to talk to hunters because their response would be, "Oh, you're the anti-hunting or anti-gun people that are trying to take away my ability to buy ammunition," because at the time, non-lead ammunition was twice the cost and very hard to find. And so it was not received very well. I think we've gained ground, and I think there is a sort of a a great community of hunters, and they're sort of starting to self-police and sort of spread their word on themselves. But we might have been able to do that a little more efficiently had we done things in a little bit different order. So that was my sort of spiel on lead. How are we doing on time?
Should be
We're
good.
pretty
Yeah,
good,
go-
yeah.
Go ahead, man.
So I'll go into the next sort of era of or kind of area of condor management that really excited me when I was there, was the nest management. So condors were nesting at fairly low rates when I started the program. And I really think this is where I found my way into the program. It's probably the reason why I got the job that I did, which led to being the supervisor, which led to be, having a decade-long career leading the Condor program in Southern California. Was my rock climbing skills sort of really helped me, sort of get my foot in the door and develop this aspect of condor recovery. So condor nesting was not doing very well. We had very low reproductive success. And so we identified that as a problem, and sort of in order to gain more information about what was causing the problem, we started becoming very hands-on with our management of nests. And to do that, it involved lots of rope rigging, lots of backcountry hiking through incredibly rugged terrain, and then climbing into condor nests where we would check on eggs, check to see if eggs were fertile, or go in periodically to handle chicks to make sure that they were developing properly. What we found was condor chicks were suffering from ingesting small anthropogenic items that we termed as microtrash. So, coin-sized pieces of glass, plastic, metal. Parents were ingesting these items and bringing it to their chick and feeding it to their chick. And chicks were developing impactions in their guts, which was causing them to starve. And so we needed to figure out how to deal with that. And again, we dealt with the proximate problem, or the symptoms, by going in and monitoring chicks' development and cleaning trash out of nests when we could. And then we also sort of started dealing with the larger issue a little bit through the regulatory framework, by working with organizations like the Forest Service, and the, say, Seneca oil fields, and these sort of other places where we identified condors sort of collecting these trash items and doing cleanup efforts and sort of correcting developing some best management practices so that condors would either not approach these areas where they would collect trash, or if they did get to these areas, they wouldn't have the trash to collect. There's probably a few other factors that play in that have nothing to do with the way we manage condors, but just had everything to do with condors' range expanding into areas that had less of a human footprint. We did see a decline in the overall number of deaths from microtrash and chicks, and we also had sort of an increase in nest success. So the early years, without sort of any nest guarding, which is sort of what we termed our nest management, we had the gray is nest failure. So we had very few successful nests. And then since nest management, we've had much better success. Still not 100% success. That first year that was pretty exciting, but we didn't, we have seen some mixed years, but overall we've seen a lot more chicks fledged in the wild as a result of our, dealing with the problems at the nest, but also dealing with the problem of microtrash away from the nest. Similarly, they saw issues in Central California with eggshell thinning, because the birds up there have a marine mammal component to their diet, and marine mammals are contaminated with DDTs. And so that was causing eggshell thinning. And so there was a sort of similar nest guarding program that was more focused on egg management than chick management in Central California. They didn't have as much sort of microtrash problems, but they did have these issues with some of the condors being contaminated with DDTs from the marine diet. As a spin-off of that, so you know, all sorts of other skills involved, you know, backcountry navigation, rock climbing, rigging and rescue, all sorts of lots of things that were sort of, again, not things I was expecting to use as a biologist, but really happy that I was, because that's pretty badass that you can rappel down into condor nests as a part of your career. As a spin-off to that, we also started developing a nest camera system to help us better monitor the nests. And this actually cut down on our need to have to go in and do the hands-on management, because we had such a great view into the nest that we could really see the development of the chick without putting our hands on it. So we developed a nest camera system. This system was actually developed by a student biologist who worked with our program for 3 or 4 years, and she really was the person, you know, kind of the brains behind doing this. And this was something she approached me, asked me, like, could we do this? And I was a little skeptical at first, and then she came with a more flushed out, developed plan, and it looked like it was something that was feasible. And you know, next thing you know, we would have cameras in, you know, 4 or 5 nests a year, and that's when that's about half the nests, or you know, 3/4 to half the nests in all of Southern California, because condor populations are still very small and there's only so many nests each year. And that really allowed us to learn more about the behavior of chicks, understand. It really allowed us to kind of take a step back from nest management to see if the sort of ultimate solution of cleaning up microtrash would be effective. Because, you know, there's sort of been this continual theme in the Condor program where you throw everything in the kitchen sink at the problem, but you never know when to step away from the management and to see if the problem has sort of corrected itself, or you've corrected the underlying cause of the problem. And these nest cameras were a way for us to do that in nesting, which was pretty incredible. I got one more thing to talk about. It's pretty quick, maybe a couple slides, and then we could do questions if we still are good on time. Otherwise, we can start questions now.
Well, you can go ahead and finish up these last couple slides, Joseph.
Awesome, great. So the last thing, and sort of kind of getting at that idea that, you know, condors have been managed at an individual level for so long, in part because there have been so few condors. One thing that I was really excited about, sort of in terms of my career, was the ability to sort of begin the transition from that individual management to population level management in condor populations. And so we've started to do that by kind of involving academics. So Vicky Backer and Myra Finkelstein out of UC Santa Cruz and University of Montana, 2 incredible population modelers, really started using all the data that we've been collecting to kind of create this model where they first tested against past, right? So they developed a model and then they compared it to past data to make sure it was true. And it involved all sorts of different variables, but essentially predicted survivorship, and then used the population sort of beginning and end point to sort of say, okay, this is where the condor population would go based on our model, on, you know, given the most influential variables that we're factoring in. And then they started to predict the future. You know, so this is where the population would go if we started to, if we just kind of managed as a status quo. One thing that's just not realistic is, you know, the resources for condor management are not growing every year with the condor population, right? It's not like we get, you know, a percent increase with the percent increase in the population. So it's sort of causing us anyways to shift away from, you know, more hands-on, you know, just focusing on individual and hands-on management to making better decisions with the resources that we have. So for example, one of those decisions are, you know, is nest management or releasing condors going to help drive the population better? And so the model sort of was able to do that. And this is sort of getting at, you know, while it's great to manage nests, it feels really good to see chicks successful in nests. If the ultimate goal is to grow the population, where are you getting the most bang for your buck? And so we did that, and really we sort of have sort of these 3 different scenarios, these 4 different scenarios. The scenario of, if we could continue to do both, we're going to grow the population the best. Or if we can, and the other end of that, if we stop doing both, we would actually, the population would kind of go flat and we really wouldn't grow all that much at all. But then what are these two? So if we continued to release condors but stopped managing nests, we would still see successful nests, but we wouldn't, and there'd be a slight dip in the level of growth, but nowhere near as much as if we did the opposite. If we stopped if we stopped growing, or if we stopped producing condors in captivity and releasing them and just managed nests to augment the population, there's a huge disparity. We would still grow, but nowhere near as much as using the release efforts that have been ongoing. So that's kind of where the condor population is going, and I think that's sort of where it was the bittersweet thing. I wanted to see how, and I still am interested in condors, obviously, but it will be exciting to see how the managers that are kind of coming up behind me use this new information to better understand and better allocate the resources we have for condor management into maximizing the population as we move forward. I have to plug the office that I work for now. They're forcing me to do, they're really not forcing me to do it, but often a question that I get is like, why did you leave, the field work and the handling of condors and the climbing into nests? Like what made you step away from that? Especially going into ecological services at the Ventura Fish and Wildlife Service office. Like I do more lawyering type of stuff. I've learned the Endangered Species Act forward and backwards, and what Section 7 is and Section 10 is, and and how those are, how you can do conservation with the law. But one of the big motivators for me was sort of expanding my ability to work with a variety of species, but also I do really think it may not be as sort of cut and dry, like every day, I could, every year that went by on the Condor program, I could see the uptick in numbers of condors that went by. Here, you're sort of using at the fish ES office, you're sort of using the tools provided in this incredible piece of legislation, the Endangered Species Act, to preserve habitat, to minimize impacts to all sorts of different wildlife, and really to do conservation in a way that's entirely different, but is still, while it's at a desk, it's still just incredibly stimulating and rewarding to do. So that's sort of where I am in my career now, and it's been I've been doing that for a little over a year, and it's pretty amazing. I was a little nervous, about leaving the field work behind, but I think there's so much that I pulled from the Condor program in terms of problem solving and collaborating and building partnerships that I'm applying to this job, that it doesn't feel all that different, even though I spend much more time in front of a computer. And with that, I gotta figure out how to unshare my screen. There.
Hey, Joseph, Lisa had a couple questions about nest success.
Yep.
Looks like, what was the basis for no failed nests in 2014 and 2007, if you were able to determine that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there was a little bit of luck involved. We were doing nest management those years, and it turns out that there were many problems that we can that we can deal with nest management, but there are still some problems that we can't. So like 25% of the time, a condor, for example, is going to lay an infertile egg, and that's sort of pretty true across most bird species, right? Sometimes they have duds. So nests fail sometimes because, for just very natural reasons. And I think we ended up being pretty lucky those 2 years, because one, we had a couple, or the pairs that were nesting those years were very experienced, and the problems that they dealt with were ones that we could deal with. They would have been micro trash. They would have been issues that we had the means of solving. So I don't think there's anything particularly special about those years, other than we sort of just lucked out with the birds that were nesting and the problems that they faced.
And condors, because of their size, I'm assuming typically just lay one egg or have one chick.
Yeah, one egg at a time. If their egg fails early on in the nesting season, they will sometimes lay a second clutch, so one more egg, and try to see if that one will hatch, which happens sometimes, but for the most part, they get one try, and if they're successful, it's one try every other year, because they're taking care of their chicks for about 12 months after they've left the nest, and it's about an 8-month nesting season. So that spans over the period of about 2 years.
If I can ask a question, I did raise my hand before Robin butted in. So thank you, Robin.
Go ahead, Jaime.
All right, Joseph. I just want I want to say great presentation, man. I really learned a lot and appreciate the education. And I wanted to say also kick-ass kind of career path that I hope a lot of our students understand, how not only what we learn in CI or what you learn in CI will be important, but what you learn from life experiences. So I appreciate having said that. I have a kind of a question with regards, well, it's two questions. One, on the pie chart, you had a 13% predation. I was wondering what actually kind of hits on such a big animal. And then the second one, on the map of the distribution and how, you have 4 sites where you release them and how they're expanding in range. I was wondering if there is any idea of what the original distribution of the condor was.
Yeah, both great questions. So the original distribution of the condors at the time of say European presence in North America was probably from British Columbia down to Baja California, and at least into the southwest of the Rockies, so Arizona and Utah. But maybe even that far east, all the way up into like Alberta. There are some tribal stories that involving condors that are in tribes in sort of in Alberta. So it's possible that the condors were a predominantly western species, so west of the Rockies. We definitely know from museum records that there were condors, the condors that were collected, and are in these museums, had a very strong marine mammal component to their diet. So many condors were utilizing marine mammal populations up and down the West Coast. And we think that the range, one of the first constrictions in their range, is related to the near decimation of marine mammal populations along the West Coast. That probably had heavily impacted condors. And it wasn't, poisoning and lead weren't issues for condors until, after that range, or that sort of range decline. Your second question was predation. So one thing that's important to point out is that the birds that are predated are often first year juveniles, either fledged from nest or released from captivity. So these are sort of naive, inexperienced birds. And the 2 major predators that we've seen in Southern California have been bobcats and mountain lions, although they have seen coyotes in Arizona as well. And we do see golden eagles sometimes, and it's not really predation. They're not feeding on the condor, but young golden eagles are pretty vicious. I think they're just trying to become killers, because that's what they are. They're the great whites of the sky. And so I think young golden eagles will sometimes find easy targets, and young inexperienced flyers are easy targets. That said, the majority of the birds that were lost to terrestrial predators. So coyotes, bobcats, and mountain lion.
Awesome, thanks.
Joseph, I have a quick question. It's
I'm gonna
more,
butt in right now. I got
oh.
another question to ask you. No, I'm just
He
go
said
for it.
to speak up.
Oh, there you go.
Do you have another question, Jaime?
I do, but I'll go after you.
Okay.
In order.
Thank you, sir. It's, in talking to a lot of colleagues, and you alluded to this too towards the end of your talk, a lot of people get into restoration or conservation because they love the species, they love the outdoors, they love the field work, come to love the field work. But the reality is you can't do field work forever, right? And so now you had a very successful career out in the field, played an integral part in Condor Recovery. Do you find with other colleagues that eventually you work your way into an office?
Yeah, I mean, yes, that office may be different. There's all sorts of different offices you can sit in, just like there's different hats in terms of field conservation as well. So, there are different. I think that's a general trend. It's not necessarily, and by all means, like I know field biologists that worked into their 60s. One of my close mentors that kind of led me into my understanding of condor nesting and condor nest management was when we were going around, climbing into condor nests, he was 65. He's this kind of scrappy Irish guy that was an incredible field biologist. So it's not to say that you can't, last forever. It was certainly factored into my own decision. I have two kids and, my family, and we like to get outside and play. We backpack and do lots of those sorts of things. And, there's only so many 90-pound packs that you can carry into these canyons before you slip and blow out a knee or do something that, you're not going to be able to recover from. And so, I've had plenty of, nobody at Fish and Wildlife Service would be happy to hear this, but I've had plenty of close calls, in those environments. I mean, it's gnarly. The Sespe and the cliffs there, none of it is rock climbing. It's all just chaws and nasty. And I've had, I've been close to having, very large boulders fall on me. I've never had any issues with rope and rigging. Fortunately, I've had a crazy experience where I was on rope and I was going over a cliff and, ended up 10 feet away from the biggest bee's nest I've ever seen in my life. And I can't imagine what that would have been, hanging like 300 feet off a cliff and, being knee deep into a gnarly bee's nest. I don't think that would have ended very well for me had that happened. So, it comes along with the job, but it's those are things that I sort of factored in. Another thing that sort of played into things for me in terms of the desk job is it's much easier to sort of have a work-life balance. And so as I had a family and had kids and those kids are getting older and wanting their dad to take them surfing and all sorts of fun stuff. Like it's, being involved in a program like the Condor program is not a 9 to 5 kind of gig. I know Robin, and as you guys working out in the islands are aware of this as well. Like when you're there, it's 24 hours a day. And even when you're not there, it can be, it's like a phone call away. So, it was sort of calculating where I was at with my career and my life. And it turned out I really enjoy the sort of regulatory side of the ESA and species conservation as well. So it's a different trip. It's a sort of a head game instead of a physical game, but I do things to keep myself, keep life interesting physically anyways. It was sort of that decision, like, man, if I want to do something outdoors and exciting, I'm sort of in a place in my life that I can just take some time off and go do that. And so that was pretty awesome.
Yeah, I know. When I was doing field work, when I was trapping, like I never wanted to go backpacking anymore for fun
Yeah,
because I did it for
absolutely.
work all the time.
Yep. Yeah, I stopped rock climbing for probably 7 or 8 years because I did it all, I mean, it wasn't really rock climbing, it wasn't recreational rock climbing, but I was doing rope work and rigging, on a, 3-4 times a month at least for work. And it was just like, yeah, it just wasn't the thing I wanted to do. So,
Yeah, thank you.
yep.
Cindy had a question, or Jaime?
Well, Cynthia wants to ask a question too. I saw that on the chat. Go for it.
Yeah, so I put it in the chat, but did they know they were looking for a rock climbing biologist, or did you kind of apply that to the condor problem? I assume if you had a different skill set, the management might look a little different.
Yeah, it's so Alan, my mentor, the Irish guy, he was sort of doing he was sort of kind of a one-man show. He was doing a postdoc, and working in Southern California on condor nests. And so, I came in as an intern when he was really starting to understand what the problems were with nests and sort of this issue of microtrash and how do we deal with it. And so, as an intern, because I had this skill set, Alan sort of tapped me as like, hey, you know what you're doing, help us come out and help me come out and get into these nests, so we can start understanding more. And so, I did that as an intern. I ended up going and working in Big Sur for a period of time, brought some of my knowledge that I gleaned from him about nesting up there, identified, nesting in Monterey County for the first time in 100 years, while I was up there doing nest work, and then came back to the service just as Alan was leaving. And it was sort of an aligning of the stars, right? So I think they were, the service was sort of realizing like, this is going to be something that we need to figure out. And I kind of was in the right place at the right time to be like, hi, I can help you figure out these things. So yeah, I mean, I certainly had an influence on the way. I mean, at that time I was not the supervisor, right, when I first came in. So, but I think I was still able to kind of play a leadership role in developing and kind of flushing out that nest management program. Which is now sort of, we're at the point now where with the cameras, we've looked at nesting success, and there doesn't appear to be the biggest, the same failure rates. I mean, those early years, it was like a 6% nesting success rate. And so now we're like, without a whole lot of nest management, we're about 50% nest success. And that's actually pretty good. Like that's kind of where you would expect a condor to be under natural conditions. And you're looking at other species like Andean condors or other large vultures, and that's about where nesting success falls for a species like that.
May I, Robin? All right.
Hey,
Hey, Joseph, one of the kind of the slides and conversations that you or one of the things that you pointed out was that it would have been better to address the hunters directly before kind of hitting them in the head with the stick, right? So carrot or stick. And here I come from kind of the social sciences and as an anthropologist, but I think there's some ESRM biology students who this kind of will apply to. So the importance of actually going out there and talking to people before to understand the kind of interaction between humans and the environment is really important, I'm assuming. So I was wondering how you addressed that conversation with the hunters so that they would understand the importance of switching ammo.
Yeah, and I mean, there's fortunately in the Condor program, because we have these different release sites. In Arizona, there is no legislation, about lead ammunition there, and so, Arizona has followed a sort of a voluntary model, and neither model is perfect, and sort of ultimately, I think we're sort of facing the same issues of how to kind of what you're getting at, Jaime, is how to market this message to the hunting and ranching community. I say hunting and ranching because I think we're quick to say hunters, but hunters are not the only people taking wildlife, and I think hunters were probably one of the first communities that were on board and fairly easy to convince. So either way, whether it was after legislation or through this voluntary effort, I think the biggest thing was first understanding what was motivating hunters. Like, why would they use lead ammunition versus a non-lead ammunition? And it really, condors were like, the way down the ladder. They weren't. That wasn't the important selling point to them. Hunters ultimately want a ammunition that performs well, and is readily available to them. And so those were sort of the biggest issues that we really started to try to deal with. So it was interesting. Some of the outreach that we were doing, in terms of the non-lead outreach, had a lot to do like we have videos and videos talking about sort of the performance of non-lead ammunition and how well it performs compared to lead ammunition, which fortunately for many calibers, it performs as good or better. And then there was sort of an issue of the price point. And I think this is where the legislation helped. Passing the legislation in California created a market for non-lead ammunition, which caused ammunition manufacturers to kind of have that certainty that they needed to produce more non-lead ammunition, which was good. So it's not that it was all bad. I don't mean to say that the legislation was all bad. I think the outreach side of things, it's something interesting and worth talking about. And then the maybe the last issue I think is sort of, because they care about the performance of the ammunition more than the conservation benefits or not. You needed to have a credible source of information, and so having the Audubon Society or the Sierra Club be the ones saying you should use non-lead ammo was not the source. Like, that's just not a credible source for the hunting community. And so we really recognized that, and so we worked with the Institute for Wildlife Studies, who's done a lot of work on the Channel Islands, and did a lot of work at doing depredation. So they were out shooting, doing pig depredation, removing animals. Like they were using firearms and ammunition and could speak sort of from a credible position that way and knew what they were talking about. Had this sort of technical expertise. When you sit down with someone, you don't want to get, you don't want to fumble, talking about, the hydrostatic shock that's created, or bullet velocities, or grain weight, and all sorts of technical terms related to ammunition. And so recognizing that in California, the hurdle was we had this legislation kind of being driven by people who weren't, the Audubon Society and the Humane Society were the main drivers of the first legislation to reduce lead. That didn't go over very well. You could go to the Humane Society's webpage even now, and a part of their platform is to stop hunting. They are not a pro-hunting organization. Audubon's pretty neutral, but it didn't help that these were the people pushing for the non-lead ammunition, even if in the end it was the thing to do for condors. So there was a bit of a hurdle. There was kind of an explanation. You need to explain what they were there. The one thing with the legislation in California, it was the IWS and the folks that are doing the non-lead outreach. They go to these hunting communities and they're like, look, the law is the law. We can't, we had nothing to do with it. There's nothing that we could do to change it. But we can help you continue to be able to hunt and help you make the transition from lead to non-lead in a way that will allow you to be successful. Arizona, they didn't have to deal with that, right? They didn't, they just started off like, their first sort of hunter outreach was, their videos were how to have a successful hunt on the Kaibab Plateau. And it's, one of their condor biologists who also happens to be an accomplished hunter doing kind of like a tutorial on elk hunting in the Kaibab Plateau, but talking about, just inserting the discussion of non-lead, and talking about the bullet's performance, and sort of then on the tail end, the conservation benefits for it. And so, it's not sort of hitting it head on from the perspective of a condor, but it's affecting change way better than if you tried to hit it head on from the perspective of a condor.
That's really great, Joseph. Let's give some students opportunities for some questions here. Sabrina, I think you had a question in the chat.
Hey, yeah. So I saw on the last page of your slides, you had a Western snowy plover on there. And I was just wondering, in your new job, do you work with Ventura Audubon?
I do not work with, well, no, because I don't do a lot of snowy plover work. I used to be the point of contact for Point Magoo. And so we did a little bit of Magoo did a lot of snowy plover work, but I was sort of the one making sure that checking the boxes, making sure they were doing the right thing for plovers. So I don't necessarily do a lot of work with snowy plovers, but in our office, we're sort of assigned species leads. And so we have a snowy plover species lead that sort of is focused on plover issues and plover conservation. I'm a co-lead for Condor. That's a sort of a no-brainer, but I'm also the lead for Arroyo toad as well. And so I've been doing sort of focusing in on learning amphibians and doing more amphibian work. I also spend a lot of time doing California tiger salamander work as well.
Oops.
But if you were interested, I could get you in touch. So, ask.
I'm the program chair for Ventura Audubon. So I saw the Western snowy and just was wondering.
Heck yeah. The Oceano Dunes decision that was just recently made is pretty crazy and exciting. That's another sort of human dynamic one that I'm interested to see sort of play out. The ATV use helps fund a lot of plover and tern conservation at that park. So how they make up for that lost revenue by going, by not having ATVs, which is probably the best thing for the habitat, will be interesting.
Any other questions from students for Joseph?
I just had like generic questions and I guess interest in any possible like internships or like paths going forward to the kind of work that you do.
Yeah.
That's a kind of general question, but
no, that's a great question. It's, partly why we're here. So in terms of career paths, the most general is if you don't know about the Texas A&M Wildlife Job Board, you should know about the Texas A&M Wildlife Job Board. That is a huge resource. It's where I began. There are places that I think, had the ability to go back, I might have done some things differently. One being, USA Jobs is sort of the sort of way that federal jobs are hired. It's another sort of job board, and it's way beyond just wildlife work, obviously. But it is where you're going to find, Fish and Wildlife Service, Park Service, and any number of the federal agencies hiring. There's been a huge push to hire, more entry-level positions. So I think, you all, if you're, coming into graduating, you do have an opportunity to kind of get your foot in the door that I don't think was there when I started. Because most of the time when I started, the jobs were temporary or term positions, and you had to sort of put your time in before you even got offered a permanent position. some of these entry level positions are permanent positions, and you can start off like, you know, as a GS7 and work your way up to a GS9 just in that one position, or GS11 just in that one position. So there is some opportunity to be paying attention to. Because of that, even if you're not a graduate, you're not close to graduating now, go into USA Jobs, you know, type in wildlife biologist or biological technician, look at the various biological positions and look at the education requirements for those positions. I had to go back to school to take a botany class.
3 units of botany.
to get the Condor program, or to get the Condor that I ended up landing. So that's you know, I wish I had done that. There are organizations like the Wildlife Society who help you along. You know, I think the Wildlife Society, you can go in and see their you know, they will tell you what classes you should be taking to make sure you make the, you know, you can get a federal job if that's what you're going for. Same with state jobs. You know, think about where you see yourself going, and you know, hone your education around that. I mean, you know, dabble for sure, but if there's some place that you're really like, I want to do, you know, field biology, you know, look at it, find someone who's doing that work or doing something similar, talk to them about what their job is, and then look at what the job description and job requirements are, and check those things off. A lot of folks ask about graduate school. I don't have my graduate education. I didn't go back and get my master's. I think those things are valuable. Those are certainly, you know, it's a competitive field, and having your master's can certainly be valuable. I was also in a position, you know, I supervised a team, a program for a long time. A master's degree was not necessarily the, you know, the thing that got someone a job. It's these other skill sets and demonstrated ability to work hard and under arduous conditions, especially for field. Like those are I mean, as a person who did hiring, being able to get along with others, you know, being able to work hard under any number of situations, you know, whether it be mentally tedious data entry or physically grueling, you know, 90-degree days hiking up 45-degree slopes, or the other end, you know, raining, coldy, and covered in mud. You know, like those were things that I wanted to see people have experience in. And then it went to having a, you know, having your master's and what sort of, you know, thinking creatively, demonstrated problem solving skills, you know, being able to MacGyver things. Like those are things that, you know, wildlife biologists often use on a day-to-day basis if you're spending lots of time in the field. And so those are things that I was very focused on when I was hiring folks. What else would be? Can
I ask a follow-up question to that?
Yeah, sure.
So I'd been interested in a position I saw, like what you were talking about, the entry level with California Fish and Wildlife, and it had required like a combination of science credits completed and like a year of mechanical background. So I actually turned in like the preliminary steps for that, an application template, and I did like a background information, like experience exam questionnaire. You know, off the top of your head of like any beginning steps? I was kind of confused by like the GS level things on USA Jobs. Is there any like beginning steps I can get into or that you know of?
Yeah, I mean, I think like, you know, a 4-year degree kind of qualifies you, I want to say, for a GS7 at least, and potentially a GS9. One thing within, you know, the federal job is sometimes there are, you know, they'll give you the option of you know, you can have, you know, a combination of botany and field experience to cover your botany credits. I don't know anyone who's ever done that successfully. Say they're not out there. Robin, you may have. You are the exception to the rule for
yeah,
sure.
So I had a combination of experience, which weighed more heavily than my college degree.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've known at least 5 people who have missed out on their dream job because not having 3 units of botany.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, and the one thing you is like, so I'm the person that does the hiring, but I'm not the first person to see the list of, or the pile of applications. You first have to go through, you know, the human resources folks, and they aren't biologists, and they don't know really thing about the need, what my needs are for condor biology. They're just checking boxes. And so these are the hoops that you have to jump through.
Yeah.
And, you know, if you're really that interested in a federal job and you have a question, you could, you know, you can contact the HR hiring official and say, can I send you my you know, transcripts, and will you, you know, can you tell me if I have everything in order? You know, maybe don't do that for the dream job.
Yeah.
To get that done beforehand, but they'll tell you if you're like, yeah, you don't need to do it. There's also, you know, there's just crazy things that you're like, I can't even believe it. Like, I know someone who had their transcripts done, you know, reported in quarters instead of semester hours, and they did not accept her transcripts. They say, you know, and some HR people are more nitpicky than others. Like, I've had my quarter hours accepted, but that's just sort of like, too bad, so sad, you know, like, life's not fair and it sucks. And you know, and I felt so bad for some of the people who went through those things, but, you know, better to know the game and start, you know, understanding what you have to do early on, because it's a competitive field to begin with, but sometimes just knowing how the system works will get you to a place where, you know, where someone else doesn't get. So you've already, you know, there's already been a you know, kind of a layer of a culling, if you will. So yeah, the other thing, the dream job, I still think the wider of a net that you can cast to get your foot in the door, this field is about your resume, and it's about building that experience. And I think, you know, the more sort of resume, you know, little, you know, blurb, more experience that you can put on your resume, and the more people that a hiring official can call and get a good reference from you or for you, the better off you'll be. You know, it is a small world, and you know, I'll often have people call me up, even if I'm not on their you know, not one of their references. Like, you know, if it's someone that I know, you know, they know me because I work in the Condor program and they were an intern on the Condor program, I'll get a call. You know, and it's a small world, and you know, the last thing you want is the wrong person, you know, in a job where you know, the stakes are high, and you're trying to conserve a species and whatnot. So, you know, there's it's kind of it's definitely sort of this give and take, and the more experience that you can get and the more sort of a network that you can build, the better off you'll be. I think doing that is finding the job that nobody wants, you know, like the duck farm in North Dakota, and, you know, go work there for a summer, you know. And I mean, it might suck, but that one guy, you know, that first reference is something that no one else, you know, that someone else probably doesn't have, and that's just sort of the reality of I think working in the field that we work in.
Thank you.
I think we're good for tonight then, unless anybody else has anything.
So much, Joseph. This was amazing.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you
Yeah,
so
thank
much,
you.
Joseph, and thanks everyone for attending, and so much great information and also knowledge on those experiences that I can concur with a lot working in this field. So thanks so much. And Mia and Chris, what's our next event? Can we announce that here?
Maddie is.
Yeah.
Aspen knows Maddie a little bit more.
Yeah, Maddie is a someone closer to a recent grad. She graduated from CSU Fullerton in biology. She also works with birds out on the islands. She's also first gen, like Joseph here. So that will be April 7th. So she's currently working on the islands. She's kind of in that, you know, middle stage between doing what Joseph is talking about, kind of getting your foot in the door with just any job you can find, which end up being really cool jobs. So I think it'll be really cool for some of, all of us. So yeah, that'll be April 7th. So
Yeah,
please join us.
lots of neat ornithology work and excellent. So yes,
Yeah.
please spread the word to other folks. It's the same link, 5 o'clock. We'll have other postings coming on Canvas, on Instagram, and we have a few more of these this semester. So
Yeah.
yeah, excellent. Thanks everybody.
Thank you. Thanks for a
Thank
great
you.
talk.